Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and tonight's story is a classic arsenic poisoning case. Or was it? I think the answer is very clear, but you'll have to let me know what you decide. This is the story of Eliza Fenning. But first, a Victorian Society tip. We've made it to August, folks. Did you know that in the US, August is the month when the most babies are born? The UK sees their baby boom in September. Seeing as we're entering baby season, I thought I'd talk a bit about how the Victorians named their babies and what the most popular Victorian baby names were. First, the royals held great societal and cultural influence over many things, and baby names were no exception. The era saw an influx of Victorias and Alberts, as well as Georges and Williams, all inspired by the royal family. Queen Victoria and Albert themselves had 9 children named Victoria, Edward, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Like today, carrying on family names is also popular. One tradition was to use the mother's maiden name as the child's middle name. Names were also handed down through multiple generations. For example, it was common that the first male child be named after their grandfather on the father's side, the second after the grandfather on the mother's side, and the third male child to be named after their father. The first female child was named after their grandmother on the mother's side, the second after their grandmother on the father's side, and the third after the mother. Genealogical records are often full of generations of family members all bearing the exact same names, making things very confusing to anyone trying to research your family tree. What's more, if a child died very young, it was often the case that the family would still try to uphold the naming traditions of their family and name the next born child the exact same as the first. Class also played a part in baby naming. Popular upper-class names such as Ada, Beatrice, or Dorothy, or Frederick, Samuel, or Cyril would trickle down to lower classes. Once they became common, different names would spring forth in elite circles, and the cycle would repeat. A trend of two-part names also emerged during the Victorian era. There were a lot of names like Mary Grace, Sarah Ann, Henry James, or Frank William, for example. Another trend, particularly for baby girls, were the names of flowers, such as Iris, Rose, Lily, Daisy, Myrtle, or Violet. Sometimes Victorians would choose a name for the nickname attached to it, such as Hattie, short for Harriet, or Bessie, short for Elizabeth. Other examples include Peggy for Margaret, Dick for Richard, or Frank for Frances. Biblical names, like eras before, remain popular, such as Samuel, Jacob, James, Joseph, John, Peter, and Thomas for boys, and Ruth, Sarah, Mary or Marie, and Hannah for girls. Many of you might have heard some very unusual sounding names to us attributed to the Victorian era, such as the literal names hate evil, fear not, and sin deny. These are called hortatory names, also called grace or virtue names, and they were actually particularly popular in Puritan circles. The Puritans tried hard to separate themselves from Roman Catholic and Anglican traditions in many ways, and names were no different. Except they still wanted to uphold the tradition of names inspired by the Bible. Curious names like kill sin, more fruit, and stand fast on high did actually exist, but they were more of a late 1600s and 1700s thing. In the 1880s, a publication called The Curiosities of Puritan Nomenclature was published. This was a response to anti-Puritan American authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who were writing characters with extremely lengthy hortatory names. This is likely why we think names like this were so common today, but in reality, they were more of the exception, not the rule. More often than not, they chose to go by a shorter, more common call name, if you will, as in his proper name is Be Thankful, but we all just call him John. In the spirit of biblical names, though, virtue names such as Charity, Prudence, Hope, and Steadfast were actually quite common. Something else you may have heard about the Victorian era was that they didn't name their babies right away, that the Victorians would sometimes wait several months and sometimes even up to a year or more to name their child because they didn't know if that child was going to survive. It's true that infant mortality rates were high in the Victorian era, but the idea that Victorians simply didn't bother to name their babies for that reason is not really true. But while it wasn't common practice, there is kind of a kernel of truth to it. First, lineage and inheritance were a big deal for Victorians. So, if families weren't sure if a child, particularly a male child, would survive, they might not name the baby right away. That way, they could reserve the family name for the next born. Also, in some faiths, a baby wasn't officially named until they were baptized. This could take anywhere from a few days to weeks, depending on the circumstances. But also, many families would baptize their children as soon as possible, sometimes even the very same day or the day after birth, owing to their belief that baptism was necessary for salvation. Finally, I will share with you the top 5 baby names for boys and girls from the 1800s. For girls in the US, we have Mary, Anna, Emma, Elizabeth, and Margaret. Top 5 girls' names in the UK were exactly the same, except adding the name Helen. For boys in both the US and UK, we have John, William, James, George, and Charles. Some common non-binary names were Ira, Jesse, Elijah, Elias, James, Jules, Rain, Archie, Leslie, and Ellis. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. The date is March 21st, 1815, and 20-year-old Eliza Fenning was finally given a chance to make dumplings for dinner for the Turner family for whom she worked as a cook. The Turners were a wealthy family residing on Chancery Lane in London, England. The patriarch of the family, Orlibar Turner, was a tradesman. He was married to Margaret, and they shared their home with their adult son, Robert, and his wife, Charlotte. The family employed one maid, Sarah Peer, 2 apprentices, and, as I already mentioned, their cook, Eliza, who had been under the family's employ since January of that year. Eliza had been working as a domestic servant since the age of 14 and was described as lively, amusing, amiable, and hardworking. And things had, by most accounts, been going well for her in the Turner home. That was up until just a few weeks prior when Charlotte Turner, the daughter-in-law of homeowner Orlibar, had reprimanded Eliza, threatening her with dismissal for entering one of the apprentices' rooms inappropriately dressed to borrow a candle. Now, this is just my personal speculation, but I don't think anything untoward was happening here. I'm imagining Eliza likely needed a candle, so she dashed to the other room to borrow one and was spotted by Charlotte in something that was not her full servant's uniform. But it turns out that Charlotte may have had ulterior motives. After this incident, Eliza confided in the maid Sarah that she had previously liked Charlotte and that she didn't have a problem with her, but now she saw her true colors and was no longer a fan. Unfortunately, it seems like Eliza may not have been the best judge of character because it turns out that Sarah was not in Eliza's corner either. She took this complaint that Eliza made straight to Charlotte. So it seems like we have a couple of bullies in the Turner's house. Eliza, though, chose the high road and kept putting forth her best effort at her job. For some time now, she had been requesting to make dumplings for the dinner menu for the house, but Charlotte was being petty and would decline any of Eliza's suggestions. Listen, full transparency, I'm painting Charlotte as the villain here. Most sources I used frame this as a one word against the other, but when you see how the story turns out, I think you may be inclined to agree with me. You'll have to let me know. Anyway, so Charlotte keeps denying Eliza the opportunity to show off her cooking skills by making dumplings. But Eliza goes ahead and orders baker's yeast anyway, and once they have it in the house, Charlotte finally relents and allows Eliza to cook steak, potatoes, and dumplings for dinner. She also made a steak pie for the apprentices. However, the dumplings did not go as planned. The dough failed to rise properly, and in the end, she was forced to serve dumplings that were described as small, black, and heavy to the family. Orlibar, his son Robert, and son's wife Charlotte all eat the dumplings anyway. And almost immediately, they all become very sick with stomach pains and vomiting. Eliza had also consumed the dumplings and was also stricken, as well as one of the apprentices who had snuck a small piece of dumpling in the kitchen. Orlibar's wife Margaret returns home and finds everyone very sick and summons a doctor. Orlibar immediately suspects it's the dumplings that's made everyone sick. When the doctor arrives, he decidedly declares that everyone afflicted in the house is suffering from arsenic poisoning. Now, if this was indeed arsenic poisoning, it was not enough to kill anyone, and everyone in the house began to slowly recover. Orlibar shows the dish the dumplings were served in to the doctor, who performed a test which involved adding water, stirring, and decanting it to find what sediment was left behind. His findings were about a half a teaspoon of white powder, which when touched to a silver knife, tarnished the knife. This, he said, conclusively proved the substance to be arsenic. He found no evidence of arsenic in the yeast or flour, leading to the conclusion that the arsenic must have been mixed in with the dough. He claimed this is also why the dough had failed to rise. Eliza, being the cook, was immediately charged and hauled off to prison, still suffering the effects of the sickness herself. Out of the gate, Eliza has very little hope for receiving a fair trial here. Her family spent literally all of their money on defense attorneys for her, who were no match for the wealthy Turner family and their pool of personal contacts and friends within the court system. The prosecution alleged that as revenge against Charlotte for disciplining her a few weeks earlier, she stole some arsenic, kept in the apprentice's office for pest control, and baked it into the dumplings with the intention of poisoning Charlotte and the rest of the family. All of the evidence against Eliza was circumstantial. Orla Barr testified that the arsenic had gone missing about 2 weeks prior to the poisoning incident. One apprentice, Roger Gadsden, the same one who was said to have gotten sick from the dumplings as well, testified he saw her in the office taking paper scraps from the drawer that the servants regularly used to light the fire. Eliza stated that yes, they often used paper scraps from the same drawer to start fires for the house, but it was inside the apprentice's office, so she never went in to get them herself. She always asked. She requested the other apprentice employed by the Turners to be questioned about this to confirm her statement, but the court wouldn't allow it. The court would also not allow the testimony of one of the first doctors who responded to the Turner home on the night of the incident. As such, the court was not made aware that Eliza herself had suffered the same sickness as the rest of the family. Eliza tried to call witnesses to testify to her good character and satisfaction in her position with the Turners, but they didn't do much good. In fact, the court entirely denied submission of one statement from Eliza's own father. Eliza tried to convince the court of her innocence, claiming the allegations were actually fueled by Charlotte Turner, who held a spite against her. The court recorder, which is effectively a judge, was John Sylvester, and he had a reputation as being a hanging judge and as being biased against female defendants. In his instructions to the jury, he stated, "The other question for your consideration is by what hand the poison was administered, and although we have nothing before us but circumstantial evidence, yet it often happens that circumstances are more conclusive than the most positive testimony. The prisoner, when taxed with poisoning the dumplings, threw the blame first on the milk, next on the yeast, and then on the sauce. But it has been proved most satisfactorily that none of these contained it, and that it was in the dumplings alone, which no person but the prisoner had made." Now, Sylvester admits that all of the evidence here was circumstantial, but based on the fact that no arsenic was found in the milk, yeast, or sauce, the poison had to have been only in the dough, and as Eliza had made the dough, the poisoning could only have been carried out by Eliza, and therefore she should hang. And based on this logic, that is what the jury decides, and Eliza is sentenced to death. However, there are a lot of problems with Sylvester's logic and the prosecution's case in general. First, was this even arsenic poisoning? One of the doctors attending to the Turners tested the remains left behind in the dumpling dish and found a substance that tarnished a knife and therefore positively confirmed the presence of arsenic. And this was fact at the time. This was science. The poison arsenic does in fact tarnish silver. But so do a number of other naturally occurring sulfides that are commonly found in foods. Foods such as cabbage, eggs, mustard, onions, and garlic. Were those ingredients in the sauce or other components of the meal? Investigators at the time didn't know to ask the question, but that does lead us to another question that no one bothered to ask, which is what makes them so sure it was the dumplings that were the problem? Given they didn't come out as Eliza hoped, by all accounts something certainly looked off about them, but that does not pinpoint arsenic poisoning. Charlotte had asked for steak, potatoes, and dumplings for dinner. It sounds like there was some sauce involving milk that was served as well. Any one of those foods could have been the culprit in a common case of food poisoning. Remember, Eliza herself became sick as well. They didn't even bother to look at the other components of the meal. They only zeroed in on the dumplings baked by Eliza. And from the sources I have, I'm not entirely sure Eliza even cooked the whole meal by herself. It doesn't even sound like they considered other possible suspects. Now, granted, I'm looking at this through a 21st century lens. Even without a background in science or law enforcement, I'm going to ask very different questions than officials back in 1815 would. However, the unfairness and inequity of Eliza's trial did not go unnoticed by her fellow middle and working class citizens. Upon her sentencing, many petitions were started for the Home Secretary and Prince Regent urging them to step in. In fact, one petitioner who took up Eliza's cause had almost convinced the Turners themselves to sign a petition granting Eliza reprieve. The only reason they did not was because the court recorder who oversaw the trial literally turned up at the house while the petitioner was there, causing the Turners to decline signing in the end. The recorder told them if they signed, they'd be forced to investigate the Turners for poisoning themselves, I guess. I can't believe that they would have come that close to signing, though, if they didn't actually think she was innocent. What's more, a chemist with no connection to the case other than an interest in the truth performed a series of experiments to see if adding arsenic to dumplings would in fact affect how they rose. Remember, this was a key piece of circumstantial evidence against Eliza. He found that adding arsenic to the dough at any point had no effect on how they rose. He went so far as to sneak arsenic into the dumplings his own cook made, then ask if anyone could detect any sort of change in their appearance or consistency, and they could not. A man by the name of Basil Montague, described as a prominent Quaker, uncovered and presented evidence to court recorder Sylvester of mental instability in Robert Turner. He had previously suffered episodes described as wild and deranged, where he had threatened harm and death to himself and wife. This evidence, of course, was dismissed by Sylvester. Now, public pressure was so great that the day before the execution, there was a meeting held at the Home Office concerning Eliza's case. The Lord Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, was out of town, but the Lord Chancellor, Lord Eldon, Court Recorder Sylvester, and at least one other official met. But in the end, they decided there was no reason to interfere with the case. Of course, the Court Recorder Sylvester would say that it was his verdict he had pushed for. That evening, Lord Eldon convened a second meeting on the matter, but again, there was no change in the outcome. Now, I believe the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, was the most senior, so maybe the outcome would have been different if he was there, but the fact that some pretty important officials met on whether or not they should step in is significant. I honestly think it's too bad the Court Recorder Sylvester was included in the conversation, as he had a marked personal interest in the execution going forward. None of this, unfortunately, changes Eliza's fate, and on July 26, 1815, her execution does go forward. A crowd of over 50,000 people gathered to witness the execution. From the scaffold, Eliza proclaimed, "Before the just and almighty God, and by the faith of Holy Sacrament I have taken, I am innocent of the offense with which I am charged." Her funeral was held 5 days later, in which nearly 10,000 people joined the procession to the church and cemetery. And in the wake of the execution and funeral, people turned on the Turner family. Immediately following the execution, a crowd of about 1,000 descended on the Turner family home, threatening to burn it down. Police managed to defuse the situation, but for days on end, hundreds would linger outside the Turner home. So far as they were concerned, Eliza Fenning had been judicially murdered, with the Turners as the catalyst behind the events. And I have to say that personally, I don't think they were wrong. At the top of this episode, I did frame Charlotte Turner as one of the villains of the story. She did seem to have motive to get rid of Eliza, even if it was petty. And one of my theories is that she framed Eliza for the poisoning, whether it was intentional arsenic poisoning or accidental food poisoning, and she let Eliza take the fall. And in the case of the trial overall, the Turners let it all happen, right? Lawmakers had tried to use Eliza as an example of what would happen to servants who stepped out of line or forgot their place in the homes they worked in. What the working and middle class saw, though, was that there were clearly two sets of roles in their judicial system, one for the wealthy and one for the poor. Writer William Home, who was described by one source as defender of press freedom and friend of the oppressed, had witnessed Eliza's execution and embarked on a mission to reveal the miscarriage of justice against her. He published the important results of an elaborate investigation into the mysterious case of Elizabeth Fenning, in which he detailed the painstaking efforts undertaken by the prosecutions to ensure Eliza's guilty verdict, in spite of evidence to the contrary. The work became, quote, a landmark in investigative journalism, and he will go on to become a household name in England, known for his high-stakes battles against censorship and as a supporter of free press. Years later, in 1829, it's said that Robert Turner, Charlotte's husband and son of Olibar Turner, made a deathbed confession of putting the arsenic in the dumplings that sickened everyone. So I think I've made it clear how I feel about Eliza's case, but I'm interested to hear what you think. If you head over to Instagram or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder, you can let me know there. I also have some photos of Eliza, the recorder John Sylvester, and more. You can also see the photos and source links on the episode blog on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. While you're on the website, you can sign up for the Good Night for a Murder newsletter. Each month I send an episode roundup, reveal of next month's episodes, and other goodies like extra Victorian Society tips, book recommendations, and more. I'm going to need a few more days to get the bonus content for housekeeper and butler tier patrons together for this episode. It's summer. My son has been home a lot. I have not had the time. Thank you in advance for your patience. There is a back catalog of bonus content up on Patreon right now, though, so if you want to learn more about Patreon and the podcast, you can visit agoodnightforamurder.com. Also follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.